Tom Chivers, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Hello. Yes, thanks for having me. I will say just to avoid it's Chivers rhymes with rivers rather than Chivers rhymes with
Chivers.
divers. It is a common mistake. So I thought I'd leap in early and get that one right. But yes, hello. Thank you for having me.
So, Tom, your body of work touches on a wide array of disciplines and covers an even wider spectrum of topics. For our listeners out there who don't know who you are or who want to hear your backstory and not just read our introduction on our website, how would you describe yourself? Like, what is the mission statement for your writing?
Well, I think I get described as a science writer, and that's probably the simplest way of doing it. Way of describing me in terms of like traditional journalism roles, science writer or science columnist or something like that. But I think of myself as sort of a nerd correspondent. I am just interested in any nerdy topic. So I'll write about science, or I might write about. I might randomly get interested in economics that day. I know you're both in the prediction markets and sort of forecasting game, and I've written a lot about that because I find that topic extremely interesting. So it's sort of my mission statement is I want to find out interesting, true things about the world and explain them to people. So yeah, nerd correspondent or nerd translator or something like that. I like to go and find things. And also, it's also part of it is trying to see when people are saying things in the media or in the news that I think are, and some narrative has been established, and they say, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. That sort of is generally my way of looking at the world. Is can I find interesting things to explain to people? Can I sort of try and break down why some of the more sort of simplistic narratives in the media might be more complicated than that? Can I try and explain science and these complicated topics to a sort of non-expert audience, I guess. Does that make sense as something like a mission statement?
It
Definitely.
does. And you just talked about how a goal of your writing is to sort of explain things to people. You spent some time at BuzzFeed, and I feel like BuzzFeed does a lot of that same work. But I feel like the way that you go about it is a bit different, at least at UnHerd and some of the other places where you write. How has your writing sort of changed, or how has the way that you've covered topics changed from your time at BuzzFeed, maybe more mainstream media, to now, where I think you have a slightly different bent?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, partly you change. I mean, your readership changes, right? The self-serving "I am so brilliant" way of describing it is your readership changes, and so you target your work to that readership. The people who would read the Telegraph were different from people who'd read BuzzFeed, were people who different from people who read UnHerd and the stuff I do now in my books and things. And so you tailor your explainer to your work to the sort of person who'd be reading it. Of course, in reality, a lot of it is you tailor your work to what your boss wants. But there is like, if you're writing, I don't know. For example, when I was writing at the Telegraph, I spent what felt to me a lot of time trying to say why it's quite a right wing conservative outlet, and my work tended to be, at least in my head, look, these sort of common things that the readership will often believe might be, climate skepticism was a thing. I would often spend a lot of time saying, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. You're simply the sort of climate gate stuff that people were hawking at there. I would try and explain why they were wrong, I think, is probably the simplest way of putting it. And then at other places I've been might be read more by people who are more left wing. So I'd find I'd be concentrating more on sort of debunking more common left wing narratives. I feel like that was part of it. Also, part of it is you'd be younger, they'd be older, you'd be sort of judging whether they'd be more educated, less educated, that sort of stuff. And I mean, at BuzzFeed, for instance, they were very particular. There's a particular way of writing for BuzzFeed, and which changed, and it's all an adaptation between how I want to write and how they want me to write and things. But it would be very much, like listicles. Everyone liked the BuzzFeed thing. there's a way of doing them while also, you know, I was looking at a piece I did recently, which was like 7 myths and facts about breastfeeding, and I'm trying to get in, you know, like trying to do in a BuzzFeed format what we know about the impact of like breastfeeding on IQ and breastfeeding on obesity and all these things, and you know, does it protect mothers from breast cancer? And I think there's, you know, and so you can do exactly the sort of thing I would like to do elsewhere. Do my sort of actions a bit more complicated than that, or it's, you know, is what we know and how we know it stuff, while doing it inside this format of 13 dogs that look like Hitler, you know, that's the sort of set, you know, the BuzzFeed listicle thing. So it was very much just you have things you want to say, you have a format of the place you are working, and you do your best to say it in the constraints and sort of habits of that format. I don't know. Yeah. So when I was at BuzzFeed, I think a lot of the stuff I was saying was much the sort of stuff I would try to do here, and still be going and speaking to scientists, going and speaking to experts, and doing sort of reported work, but it would be formatted differently and sometimes targeted it differently because of the audience.
Do you think sort of operating within that, you know, BuzzFeed constraint, you know, helped you in some ways communicate these sort of countered these narratives? Whereas if you were writing for a more traditional outlet, that you wouldn't have sort of like learned those skills because, you know, you were put into this framework of which you had to write in?
Sure. So yes, short answer, yes. Long answer, also yes, but with more words, I guess. So yeah, the long answer is yes, it did. But it was the thing that really made me a better journalist at BuzzFeed was that I was more of a reporter. After a year or so, they made me a science writer or science reporter, and my job was literally involving breaking, you know, trying to do breaking news, as you know, not investigative journalism things, and actually snuffling out stories in a more traditional way, as well as just what I've done both before and since has been more around comment on analysis. And so, you know, which you've not worked as journalists, I don't think, so maybe the distinction isn't so clear, but there are news reporters who go and find out stories and write that simple 800 words, Boris Johnson said this today, and then there's the comment and opinion guys who say what I think about Boris Johnson, say, you know, Boris Johnson must resign, or, you know, and what this means for Boris Johnson's political coalition within the Tory party or whatever. And so there's the sort of the actual truffle hounds, the real news guys, are the ones who the engine of journalism, do the actual work, and then there's vultures like me who hang around doing these sort of well, now they've done the hard work, I can say what I think about it, you know. And I'm being a bit unfair on myself there, because I do like to do actual reporting and go and speaking to experts, but that bit of finding out news and going and sniffing things out, and then also just doing the really hard work, the sort of boot leather journalism stuff, was really useful, and I learned that from journalism, from BuzzFeed much more. And yes, also because actually, as well as the Telegraph, for a while, years ago, 2008 or something like that, I worked at a London tabloid called the London Paper, which has long since died, and at BuzzFeed as well. There are two places which much more sort of emphasis on brevity and getting your point across quickly and saying the thing you needed saying without sort of wording around it for ages. And I think that's really useful, because you can be a smart ass, can't you? And you sort of use long words when you don't need to. I remember one sub at the London Paper just sort of like, why have you, I used the word gravid instead of pregnant or something like that, and it's, why? Either people won't understand it or they'll think you're a dick, and and so I just like, okay, stop doing that. And there's realizing you never ever need to use a different word other than say to say someone has said something. You never need to say opined. You never need to say, you know,
pontificated.
Yeah, exactly. It's just
definitely
like,
not pontificated.
Exactly. He say he said, right? Say he said it, or maybe say he added, and that is fine, and you're done, and it's all right. And so I feel like that is, I think that had that sort of thing, just like trying to communicate so the reader finds it easier to understand rather than to make you look clever, is been really useful for me because I, in particular, do like to look clever, and so I try, so it's been a real sort of like try not to follow that instinct of my own. And I think BuzzFeed was very good for that, and I think a lot of people who write in there's a real tendency for clever people who write for themselves to sort of think they need to sound like they are writerly and use long writerly words. And with the best will in the world, guys, I think American journalists are terrible for this. There's a real distinction between British and American journalism, which I think British journalism thinks of itself as like a trade, and American journalism thinks of itself as a profession. And a lot of American journalists think they want sort of secretly want to be novelists, and British journalists want to bring down a government, and that is so there's a sort of distinction between there's a real sort of tendency in American journalism, like I somewhat snobbily, to sort of do these 7-paragraph drops before they actually tell you then 13 people were killed in a bus crash this morning. So I have that tendency in myself as well, having it beaten out of me by both BuzzFeed years ago, by the London paper tabloid. It's been. Now, is my internet still all right? I'm still.
Yeah,
right.
You were lagging out, but I think we're good now.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good. I was probably just bored of me ranting on. Anyway, sorry. Carry on. Yes. Yeah.
No, not at all. And actually, sort of pulling at a similar thread. All this talk about BuzzFeed and the writing you do now. It sort of gets at this idea of almost like a divide, or just an interesting relationship between mainstream media and some other outlets and how they cover stories. Looking at a lot of your stories at UnHerd, you're taking these stories that maybe mainstream media sort of presented as somewhat one-sided or monochromatic, and providing a nuanced view on them, and sort of highlighting maybe a bit of a frustration with how mainstream media covers certain topics. How would you categorize sort of this problem with mainstream media, and how they maybe don't provide every side to a story, or potentially have a bit of an agenda when it comes to coverage of certain issues?
Sure. Well, I mean, this is going to be me speculating wildly and having my own opinion. I don't claim to have the full story for why journalism is, but I think there are various problems with it, and part of it is that journalists there's not very many of us. We're quite a small, there's a few if you talk about, so there's a sort of fairly, I suppose certainly in the UK media, and I think in US media, there's sort of elite journalists are quite a small group. We all know each other, we all chat with each other, we all follow each other on Twitter, and there's a real tendency to, when like any other group of people, there will be a tendency for, groupthink is such a cursed phrase, but you don't tend to want to swim against the current too much. If people say, if some story breaks and it is immediately seen as following some, fitting some narrative, fitting some sort of shape immediately, then and a lot of journalists start saying that, then it is very hard for other ones to sort of put their hand up and say, I'm not sure it's as easy as that. There's obviously the same sort of problem with tribalism as everywhere else, so that if you start saying, oh look, this story about, oh God, I'm trying to think of a not immediately super controversial example, but so this story about, I don't know, what's that? The Covington guys.
Oh, the sleaze.
Yeah, amazing. No, remember the guys, the public school kids in the States who had people who were they looked like they were shouting at some Native American.
Oh, at the Native American.
Oh,
yeah. And then it turned out to be more
protest,
complicated than that,
Yeah.
And I amazing. My attempt to come up with a less controversial example is this horrible, that is the potential racism thing. But anyway, if that story broke and there was a big decision that it was told one story, and then a more right-wing media said it tells it actually this other story, and of course if you are of the left or of the liberal side, you don't necessarily want to admit that it's more complicated, because that feels like you're giving something to the other side, so everyone entrenches, and these just that's definitely a mechanism that happens. I mean, also I don't. I want to defend journalism on the whole, because I think, and I say this in the book, that journalism gets a bad rep, and I think a lot of people think we're all either just deliberately out to mislead people and things like that. And I think actually no, a lot of journalists, or most journalists, are well intentioned and trying to do good in the world. But there is a tension between journalism as truth-telling, journalism as finding things out and explaining it, and journalism as sort of campaigning, and journalism as trying to achieve things in the world. And if you want to be, if you want to say this is a complicated story with all these ins and outs and nuances, that might make it more complicated. If you also want to say, and this is a call to action, why we all want to rally to a flag, and there are lots of these stories are powerful, if you leave them relatively unexamined, are very powerful flags or stories that can be used in. So just incentive wise, well, that if you are trying to do good in the world, but you think your way of doing good in the world is to rally people to a flag, then it might be that examining nuance and examining complexity is not super helpful. And then there's also the obvious financial or business world incentive that, fundamentally anger and controversy and a lack of
catastrophe
complexity. Yeah, well, yeah, they sell things. If you are, the example I always think of was, and I can never remember, I think it might have been Christchurch, the New Zealand shooting, awful thing, guy going and shooting loads of kids in a school, if I remember rightly, just horrible. But it covered all the front pages in the UK, right? And I was thinking, on the one hand, this is awful and a tragedy, but on the other hand, is that our front pages in this, we are as far away as is possible to be from New Zealand while still remaining on land, and yet because it is dramatic and shocking and horrifying, it covers all our front pages. It doesn't actually tell the people in the UK anything about their lives, or doesn't give you useful information for judging our own risk of being caught up in a school shooting, because it is big news because it is shocking. And so that is sort of and newspapers and the media in general want dramatic things that will get eyeballs on it, will get newspaper sales up, will get clicks on the website, that sort of thing. And that isn't to belittle the horror of that story, but in actual risk terms, it is of negligible importance to UK readers and viewers. But so the point is that the media is not there to tell you things that help you navigate the world. Media is only partly there. It is mainly there to it's a business like any other, and it will sell. Its currency is attention, eyes on websites, clicks on websites, eyes on channels, newspapers sold, and all that sort of stuff. And that only aligns partially well with the incentive to tell truth about the world and help people navigate it. And so when you have these more complex topics, or these sort of controversial topics, or where there's possibility of selling a simple narrative, or this is very complicated and you need to read this 2,000 word article to understand it all. Understandably, often the thing that sells better is here to take the outrage version and go, and you can be on your way after reading the headline, rather than then having to dig into the more complicated thing. So that's, and the other thing, of course, is it's cheaper to do. If it is quicker and easier for me to write out, say, 800 words on why I'm outraged than it is for me to spend a day or two investigating the thing, phoning up experts, phoning up people who were there, and spending ages on it, because I can do 5 of the first one in a day, and I could take me a couple of days to do the second one. And if I'm being paid by the word, which is oversimplifying things, but is kind of what happens, then the first one for me and my employers is quicker and simpler and easier. So I think those are a lot of the mechanisms why it goes wrong.
So a lot of those issues that you mentioned, groupthink. I think another one is treating everything as if it's the most important thing about the future. This happens. This fundamentally changes everything about the future. Campaigning, not dealing with nuance, not contextualizing things. A lot of that could sort of be solved if forecasting and prediction markets were more present within media. You know, Andrew and I have talked about that they could almost act as a check or even an alternative to mainstream media, right? If you're doing a good forecast, you're considering a base rate, which is your context, right? How often do shootings happen? If we're, taking that example. If you're trying to be a good forecaster, if you only look at one point of view, you're probably going to do pretty poorly. You have to consider all the alternative hypotheses, all the alternative perspectives. The one thing it doesn't really solve is the effort to outcome in terms of what it does, because making a good forecast, as you know, I assume
it's hard work.
You've been making forecasts. Yes, it is hard work, and it can be even harder to then take how you did that forecast and condense it down into something that's not 2,000 words long or whatever. But you've sort of started to experiment with using predictions from super forecasters, whether that's with fortnightly forecasts, meticulous questions, or writing some of your own questions. And so I'm curious, like, where do you see the forecasting space evolving into the news and into the larger media environment? And where do you see that? And then where would you like to see it be?
Funny enough, I'm glad we're talking about this, because I've been asked to do a thing for the Association of British Science Writers about the future of science journalism, and I've been thinking actually the talking about the use of formal forecasting in journalism be a good thing to talk about. So thank you for giving me a chance to sort of try and put together some coherent thoughts before I start writing. Okay, so I think first I'll try and talk about a little. I did an AMA on the effective altruism site a while ago, and people was, like, when will people start doing like a formal forecast, 60% likelihood on the end of every comment piece. And I think that will never happen. I think that'll never happen for a variety of reasons. One of which is that, even, charitable reason, which is that it's not really what a lot of comment pieces are there for. I remember I wrote a piece saying, oh God, what was, a way of, about big pharma profiting off the pandemic, and people saying, this is dreadful, and me saying, well, actually, you kind of want big pharma too, but here are ways of it is a problem that these drugs don't get to the developing world so quickly, but there are ways around that. We can use advanced market commitments, that sort of thing. And I could have tagged on the end of that a forecast saying, I think it is 55% likely that COVAX or someone will use an advanced market commitment to purchase vaccines for the developing world. But it wasn't really what the piece was about. The piece was sort of analysing the issues and saying this is, and these are possible ways around it. You can turn it into, I guess, into some conditional probability. If we do an advanced market commitment, I predict that there is an 80% likely chance, 80% likelihood that that then the number of people getting vaccines in Botswana will be greater than 15% or whatever. I don't know. I'm trying to sort of ad lib it as I go along. But the point is, it would have been an addition to. It would have been a sort of thing just stuck on top like a cherry, rather than the sort of the cake itself. Also, the fact that I was, when I do them. Often, like, I spent a day writing a piece, 2 days writing a piece, and I've interviewed all these experts. I'm trying to sort of analyze the thing, and then I'll be doing a proposal on a forecast on top of it. But as you guys, I'm sure, know, or certainly as other super forecasters have told me, one of the best predictors of whether a forecast is any good or not is how much time you spend on it. And I will not be spending, I'm not being paid to spend a great deal of time on it for the for that reason. As I'm being so I'll be doing it as a God, I've got to be quick, and so God knows, you probably, I don't know if you've seen any of my forecasts. I don't want to know what my Briar score is. It is almost certainly rubbish, but I keep needing to go back and do it all, but I'm kind of scared of what the result will be. And that is partly because I don't spend as much time as I do on the actual thing. Another reason is that, again, it's not the journalism has these other functions. So like, it would be if I was doing news reporting and finding out, Boris Johnson and his parties are in the news today. You know, he's it turns out there were parties going on in number 10 Downing Street while everyone else was in massive lockdown, and it was completely legal. Again, there are forecasts that can be made around that, but the actual work of finding the sources, digging into the system, and like just literally finding this stuff out, that's not prediction stuff. And also there's the entertainment side of journalism, which pays for all the important stuff. You know, people get sniffy about the time we spend covering the Kardashians or doing sports, but it literally pays for the foreign news that people think we should do more of. So that stuff, it'll never be the core function of journalism, doing these forecasts. And before I add to it, that there's also no one wants to look bad. You know, no one wants to look like an idiot for getting all these forecasts wrong. That said, so those are the reasons why it'll never be the central thing. It'll never be in every single piece. That said, I do think a subset of journalists really do want to virtuously sort of try and understand the meaning of the things they're talking about, to make and they recognize, I certainly recognize the value of making these forecasts, to sort of tie yourself, to try and work out what's that Eliezer Yudkowsky phrase of like, make your beliefs pay rent. You know, like if you believe that something is important, then it should have an associated prediction. You know, I predict that if I think this thing, if I think that advanced market commitments are important and good, then it should cash out into some sort of prediction that I can make about the world. That one might have been quite a complicated one, but if I believe, I don't know, that COVID is that COVID is less dangerous now, then maybe that should cash out to, I predict that there will be fewer deaths this year than there were last year, that sort of thing. And I think it is good and virtuous and sort of a good exercise for the mind to help you, sort of to force you to actually think about what your beliefs mean, and to tie you to, if I just say, well, this year will be difficult for Boris Johnson, what does that mean? If I mean, I think there's about a 60% chance he's going to have to leave office this year, that ties me to something much more rigorous. And then you can sort of look at your own, it forces you to then look at your own work. And if you get it wrong all the time, then it forces you to think about why that is. I do think, though, there's a danger, right, that I end up saying, we all end up doing this. We all end up saying, loads of journalists do it, and then we rank journalists by how well they did. And I, partly out of self-interest, because I don't think I do particularly well at it, but that I don't, like I say, it's not the core function of journalism. I think it is a useful thing and I think it would be better for journalists so they do it more. And I think you can learn a lot about yourself and learn a lot about your abilities and about the world by doing it. But I don't want to end up in a situation where if your Briar score is above 0.8 or something, I can't remember what the numbers are in Briar scores, then you are a rubbish journalist and you should be drummed out of the trade. So because I think that would be unhelpful. It should be a thing that people are rewarded for doing at all, rather than punished for doing badly. Again, though, declare your interest. I'd make these predictions, and I'm afraid of looking like an idiot as it is. So maybe I'm just trying to cover my own back a bit here.
So
sorry, did that answer your question?
Yeah, but just like a follow up on that. First of all, the best way to get good at forecasting is just practice. There's no one is born a super forecaster. It's something that they have to work for. And so I think there's one thing, which is, should journalists be making forecasts? And for that, I definitely see your points, although I do think if you're writing a piece about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and you're trying to make a case about why this is really important and that an invasion is likely, if you're not supporting that with some sort of context for how likely it is, like not only like how should I, how urgent is this for me listening, like how important of an issue is this, and then also like if you just go around like saying war is likely all the time, like that probably has a negative downstream effect in terms of how people are interfacing with the information that they're reading from a publication. And so I think that's on like the journalist side. But instead of you, Tom, making your own forecasts, you could if you're just covering Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. intelligence analysts say that it's likely that Russia is getting ready to invade, that can be supplemented with, well, the super forecasters from Good Judgment Inc., put it at 15%, and that's an important context piece that should be, put into it, because, I think a lot of, if you read something is likely, but they're not really saying what it is, that gives the outlet a lot of, leeway to say, oh, actually,
60% likely,
yeah,
or 90% likely, yeah.
But for like the reader, they just probably contextualize that they just keep getting it wrong. Whereas if there was a track record, or using other people that have good track records in their own reporting, that it might give a little bit more nuance to what's happening, instead of just every single time that there seems to be a flare up, the world is ending always, right?
No, I agree with that. And actually, your point about just having it as a default. I suppose the sort of example you're thinking of, the political questions, especially foreign policy, foreign relations, when let's face it, will Russia invade someone, or will Afghanistan fall? These sort of, will Taiwan, will there be a combat between Taiwan and China? These sort of questions, they lend themselves really well to that sort of to forecasting. And I do actually, I slightly row back. I suppose I was thinking of my own form of journalism, where if I went, I would be rare. It'd be rare that I made any sort of concrete opinions about what was going to happen in Taiwan, because I haven't got a clue. But if I was a foreign policy pundit, and I went around saying that I think war with China is likely, and I said that every year, then I would feel that is a bit empty if I haven't tied myself to some sort of falsifiable prediction. So yes, I agree with you, but also that I really like that idea, and I will steal it for this thing I'm writing. That it should be much more regularly, like just in the same way you would phone up I would phone up a scientist and ask for information and them to talk me through, and I'm writing something about vaccines, just checking Metaculus or checking Good Judgment Inc. and seeing what the sort of state of forecast is on that would be a really useful sense check on the sort of analytical and comment pieces that I write and that people do write. So yes, I think that'll be extremely useful, and hopefully will become more normalized. I feel like I'm one of the few journalists who still does that, who does that sort of thing, who is aware of this subset of the world yet. But I think we are, those few of us who are making it more widespread, I hope, and so hopefully it'll be become more standard in more in more mainstream outlets than the ones than me, and people like me.
Yeah, and just like one.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just like one more thing I was gonna throw in is also, like, if you're talking to experts about like where the pandemic is going, while they they might say, oh, like it looks like we're gonna see like a big death spike coming soon. I feel like asking them, well, clearly your prediction, even if it's not quantified, is different from what they're saying. What's missing? Because then not only are you giving context to readers, then you can then share that article with forecasters, and then they can maybe they read that piece, that doctor realized that they're missing something, and then does the market shift? Maybe actually there was a piece of information missing, and so then we have then news can also help us better understand the future too.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on. What were you going to say, Andrew?
Yeah, just I would add also, I think the most important part goes even beyond journalism, right? Because journalism's become democratized and everybody's a journalist now. And so everybody has to be confronted with opinions and viewpoints that maybe they didn't have to before. And so now with this new inundation of information, of news, of takes, where everybody's a pundit, the average person needs a way to sort of understand and sift through all this information and figure out how to understand all these different perspectives. And I think forecasting prediction markets provide a way for the average consumer of information, of news, from all these places, from mainstream media to Twitter to whatever, to sort of contextualize and sort of compartmentalize what they're hearing, what they're understanding, because there's so much out there right now, it's hard to sort of take it all in. So I think, yeah, this is all really interesting. But I think a big part to this adoption, is the ability of people to understand and process these forecasts, this information. And that comes down to numeracy and being sort of literate with numbers, not being facile and able to understand sort of very basic statistics. How much work do you think that we need to sort of get to a place where the average person is at a solid base level of numeracy? I know you've talked about before how when it comes to democracies, literacy is a very important component to sort of read the news, write the news, hold the government accountable. And in this age of COVID, we've seen a lot of numbers flying around, a lot of like statistics, R values, things that people might not have been familiar with prior. How much work do you think we need to get to a place where people are able to reasonably take
A lot
this
of work.
information?
Yeah, a lot of work. I mean, when you're talking about the average consumer, and I don't want to be too elitist about this, but I do remember first and foremost, I completely agree with you. I think I say this in the book at some point. The reason that or a reason that the British state at least started to campaign for for greater literacy. The book was How to Read Numbers, written by me and my cousin David, and out about a year ago now. I think the paperback's coming out soon. And one of the reasons that that the British government in the 1900s started the campaign of universal education was because it was moving to a more democratic state, and the ordinary people were going to be involved in decisions of government, decisions of state, right? And there was I can't remember the quote, but so there were people say, well, if they're going to making decisions that affect our lives, they're going to need to be able to read newspapers to find out what is actually going on. They can't vote they can't if they don't know what's happening with what the government's doing, then they can't make informed decisions. And I think it probably was true then, but it's certainly true now. That it is also true of numeracy. If you will read that the government has spent £5 million on whatever, and is that a lot? Is that a big number? Or you'll say that 160,000 people died of whatever in the past however many years, and is that a lot? Is that a big number? How do I find out, right? And most of the time, it's really not that complicated in sort of real terms. It is usually divide one number by another. What number do I need to think of to divide this number by to put it into context? But I think a lot of people feel very intimidated by numbers. A lot of people feel almost that they don't have permission to do it. I think that is. I remember listening to I think it was a Jaya Kotra, who I don't know if any of you know, but she works on AI with Open Philanthropy, so quite aligned with the super forecaster sort of world. But anyway, and she said she'd got an advanced degree in mathematics, and most of her job involved sort of this sort of simple divide one number by another to get get base rates and all this sort of stuff. But it was just, she felt that having this advanced degree felt like she was allowed. It was just felt like she could. It was not intimidated by the idea of doing this, and I sort of feel the same. I'm not by any means a maths genius, but because I have been doing it for a while, I feel like I have the sort of permission to the confidence to just go and divide this one thing by another, or multiply this one thing by another, and find out some sort of is that a big number we're talking about, and so on. And I think a lot of people don't have that. I remember not long after the book came out, I did a podcast with some people from the Royal Statistical Society, and one of the people who was on with me works on national numeracy, and he said, oh God, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was the median Briton has math to roughly a 12-year-old schooling level or something like that. That as in the level you would expect so it's just certainly below exams we take at CA. I think there's the median person in the UK is not very maths literate, is very sort of scared of doing maths, and I think I would be startled to find that weren't the case in the US as well. So I think there's an awful lot of work to do. I don't know how doable it is, or whether we just need to think, that there will be. By the way, is my internet going terrible again?
It got fixed.
Okay, cool. Hopefully it's recording anyway. So I don't know how fixable it is. You can obviously, there are improvements you can make in. We are more literate and numerate than we were 100 years ago. I don't know what the ceiling is for that and how much higher people can get. I think it would be good if we did, but then also, this is the bit in the conversation where I say, and therefore we should teach statistics in schools, because that is what everyone always says. We should teach this thing that I like in schools more, but then no one ever says, and we should teach less of this other thing to make up for it in the curriculum. And I probably would huffily say something, maybe we don't need to do quite so much personal and social, religious education or whatever, comparative religion, whatever. But I don't know. That is, that's for someone else to do, else to talk about. I think certainly, there is a lot of work to be done about in basic numeracy in Western society, and I think it would probably be really useful if people were more capable of just this sort of thing, like looking for base rates, looking for asking simple questions like, is this a big number, and that sort of question. But I don't know how we get there from here.
I've thought about this. People don't have good numeracy, but they do a lot of things that deal with numeracy. Sports betting is a very big thing in the UK as well as the US, and understanding odds and sort of how those work requires an understanding of numbers. Fantasy sports, at least in the United States, are an extremely popular thing. And to the people that do it, I'm told that you need to know how to do numbers in order to do well. I don't do fantasy sports, but that's what I hear.
I do.
And, when you think about making predictions on prediction platforms, I think you really have to understand numbers. I think on also like a really complex level, like just like going from a 50 to a 55% is very different from 55 to 60. The difference between, 68 and 70 is way smaller than 99.1 and 99.2. And so like, do you think, people just making predictions about the future might help them become numerically literate, because there is some sort of, gamified aspect of it. And it really does sort of cross like a broad spectrum of how to understand numbers, because they don't work in terms of how they seem. It's not like a 1 to 100 scale. It's very sort of nuanced when it comes to that.
Yeah. So my big pessimistic rant a minute ago, I will say pandemic made me realize, or made me think, and I have no numbers to back this up, ironically enough, but I do think there is a when people had to understand statistical concepts, they did. Certainly I saw a lot of political journalists suddenly pick up what an R value was in remarkable speed, and I think most of the British population, and I don't know, but I would imagine the American population as well, got the hang of these things, exponential growth, R values, infection fatality rates, whatever. And I'm not suggesting they became experts in it, but they were conversant enough to be able to understand it. And like you say, when they need to understand something when people need to understand something for something they enjoy or for work, then they become pretty numerate often. I don't know how true it is, because let's face it, a lot of people do sports betting and lose a lot of money. So I'm not sure how, I'm not sure if you can follow that example all the way. But
too many parlays.
But I think it is true that you can just anything where you're incentivized through financial or other means to understand it, people will often get lots better at it. I think, and yes, if people were making prediction market bets on forecasts, then they would rapidly get better at it in a way that I have yet to, but I imagine will one day. And the more people do this, the more it will become normal. The question is how quickly it expands, and like I've said, I think it would be great if it does, but I would be a little surprised if the median Briton ever ends up being making 30 meticulous forecasts a week. But I suppose you can dream, can't you? Here's hoping.
So given your job as a writer, and we've already talked about some of the issues with mainstream media earlier today. One, would you say that your information diet sort of the news that you consume personally is different than maybe an average consumer, just given your profession? And then also just generally curious, do you think about it in terms of, certain outlets or certain platforms, mediums? How do you think about the information that you consume? And are you sort of very sort of diligent about it? Like, do you think about it actively when you're consuming?
I think about it in the sense that I know I should be more diligent than I am. I'm uncovered. So one thing I will say is that I read almost no news, and I which is weird for a journalist to say. I have this. I will sometimes. I'll sort of just think, oh God, I better go and check the front page of the BBC or front page of the Times website. But I as I was saying earlier, I don't think that news judgment, news values, or the sort of thing that reaches the front page of a newspaper correlates very well with the sort of thing that is important to know about. I think, which sounds dreadful, but because I've dedicated my career to doing it, but I do think there is sort of, the shootings example is the one I come back to, but I think it's not unrepresentative. A lot of it works in this sort of lieu of entertainment or sort of shock horror stuff, and I don't think you actually need to. Whereas, to some degree, political news, political rumors, and all these sort of things, it can be more important, but a lot of it is just politician says thing you expect politician to say, and I don't. So, I mean, my actual data, a lot of my sort of actually trying to understand it, the stuff I do read, the news stuff, tends to be filtered through Twitter, which is, I don't know, extremely unhealthy, probably an unhealthy way of doing it, but it does mean that it's filtered through other people's judgment, and then and DM groups and private chats and things where people where it's hopefully it's filtered through other people's attention, and then I get the stuff that I sort of need to read about. But that's slightly outsourcing my judgment to other people. But a lot of it is, I read nerdy blog posts and things on Rationalist or EA or Super Forecaster sites. These are the and I read books, and I feel like a lot of the time it's not super helpful to have the most recently written thing. It's you can learn more about the world in slower forms, and it is. Yeah, I think this is a long-winded way of saying my information diet is incredibly chaotic, and depends on what people around me are talking about that day, and will often be completely arbitrary, or just happens to be some blog post written by some pseudonymous rationalist 6 years ago, but I happen to find interesting. So it is not. It is not rigorous, and perhaps it should be, but it seems to work. So I don't feel an immediate urge to change it.
Tom, the last question is: would you consider forecasts to be part of your information diet?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I do spend some time on Metaculus. I think actually it's usually in a more roundabout way, though, which is that I personally know a number of super forecasters and have a tendency to sort of just message them and say, so what should I think of, what's this situation? How should I ask, how should I go about asking this question? What are the things that I might, and they, even if they're not experts in that specific topic, I mean, the whole point is, even if they're not experts in that specific topic, they will have what is the way of breaking this question down? What are the sort of things you should be talking about? And I do like also just keeping using them as sort of, when I do write, because I don't know if you saw 6 months or a year ago, I did doing pieces about was it Afghanistan, or was it, I think it was Taiwan. Anyway, so just sort of like saying of using forecasts as a sort of a structure, a skeleton for me to write the piece around, and sort of these are the forecasts I made. These are what would be. So yes, I do consider. I mean, Metaculus is the one I know best, but I've also I've got a login at Good Judgment Project. I do keep an eye on it. I do try and make use of it as when I can. But again, because of the sheer chaos of my information diet, there'll be days I do it several days in a row, and then other days when I forget about it. The times when I forget about it for a week and don't check. So it's my junk food information diet does mean that it's not as regulated or as rigorous a way of using it as it probably ought to be if I was being better about it.
Well, awesome. Tom,
Sure.
before we sign off on the podcast, where can everyone find you, and any exciting new projects coming up or articles?
Yeah, so at the moment, probably the easiest way to find me is Twitter @Tom Chivers. I have also got but most of my work is at UnHerd, so unherd.com and then /author/Tom Chivers. But if you just Google Tom Chivers UnHerd, I crop up there. And any other projects? Well, I guess I could announce that I'm just about to sign a book contract. Yeah, put some personal news here, guys. I'm about to sign a book contract to write a book about Bayes' theorem, and its use in things like super forecasting, but also its relevance to the human brain, and is it Bayesian versus frequentist statistics, and all these other things. Just sort of how this one weird trick explains everything. So that'll be a project over the next year or so, and which I guess this will be my formal announcement of it. So breaking news. You heard it here first.
Congratulations, that's exciting. We can't
Thank
wait
you very much.
to read it as forecasters and as students of Bayes' theorem. So
yeah,
excited for that.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, that was a lot of fun. I better go down and cook the kids dinner now or something. Anyway, so lovely talking to you both, and another time, I hope.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
My pleasure. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.